Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into siege economics, Leningrad and logistics. Picture a modern city cut off in a single afternoon. On September 8, 1941, the last land route into Leningrad closed, and with a few hard movements on the map, strategy turned into stomachs. The German High Command chose not to storm the city street by street. Instead, they tightened a ring and let arithmetic do the fighting. Every day inside the city became a math problem. How many calories were left? How many mouths to feed? How many days until something gave? From the north, Finnish positions pressed down. From the south and west, German forces sealed the roads and rail lines. What did that do? It turned a metropolis of millions into an island without a sea. And the only possible bridge to the outside was a lake. Not a highway. Not a railway. A lake. Lake Ladoga. In summer, it was water. In winter, if the ice held, it was something else entirely. Think about the fragility of that. Your supply line is at the mercy of weather, wind, and thickness of ice measured in centimeters. That is not logistics by preference. That is logistics by desperation. Inside the city, officials had to redefine what it meant to keep a society alive. Food stores were finite. Warehouses could be mapped and counted. So leadership did what centralized systems do under pressure: they rationed. They categorized people by function, by perceived necessity to the war effort, and assigned different shares of bread. Not because anyone thought it was fair in the moral sense, but because it looked fair to the spreadsheet. Calories were triaged into priority lanes. The city's economy shrank into a handful of numbers on paper, and those numbers would decide who could work, who could march, and who could eat. Now, pause for a moment and imagine the psychological shift. Yesterday, bread was ordinary. Today, bread is a unit of survival, a token that the state issues in grams. The battlefield is outside the walls, yes, but it is also in the bakeries, in the queues, in the ledger books. When roads are cut, incentives change. People reposition themselves to where the calories are. Work assignments matter more. Identity cards matter more. Rumors matter more. Trust narrows. And every rumor about a convoy, every whisper about a warehouse, becomes a market signal, even if there is no market price. And yet, even in this tightening ring, choice does not disappear. It just becomes costly. Do you spend the last energy walking to a distribution point, or do you stay warm to save a few calories? Do you trade a personal possession for a bite of food, or do you hold out for tomorrow? Multiply those choices by 1 million people, day after day, and you begin to see how siege turns a city into a living laboratory of incentives and trade-offs. This is where the story becomes both brutal and strangely precise. The front lines decide whether trucks can move. The weather decides whether a lake can bear weight. The officials decide how to divide what comes in. And ordinary people decide, quietly and constantly, how to convert whatever they have into fuel for one more day. Strategy, logistics, and human agency braided together, measured not in meters gained, but in grams issued. In the minutes ahead, we will examine how those ration categories were built, how the lowest point in November changed survival odds, what it meant when bread stopped being just bread, and how an ice road across a lake tried to feed a city. But for now, hold on to this frame. Once Leningrad was encircled, hunger was not a side effect of war. It was the method. And the currency was calories. Here is how survival was organized on paper. The city divided people into categories, not by popularity or connections, but by what officials believed each body needed to keep the war machine turning. Manual workers sat at the top of that logic. If you lifted, hauled, turned lathes, or kept trams and boilers moving, you were classified as heavy labor. Below that came office staff and clerks. Then dependents, meaning those not in formal employment. And children formed their own category, with age notes scribbled into the margins. Later, a new priority tier appeared for critical war industries and certain specialists, because a skilled technician can sometimes keep a whole factory alive. On the surface, this looks tidy. Each category maps to a daily allowance, counted in grams, not feelings. You received a coupon book or a ration card stamped with your classification. The card said what you could pick up, when you could collect it, and sometimes from which bakery or distribution point. Think of it like a citywide calendar where your appointment is bread, and the price is time and energy to wait in line. At the counter, your coupon was torn or stamped, the loaf weighed, and the transaction recorded in a ledger that mattered as much as any cash register. But categories do more than sort people, they sort incentives. If your household has a manual worker, one card brings in more calories than another. That changes household decisions. Do you try to shift into a factory job? Do you keep working through sickness because staying on the roster keeps the family's intake up? If you are an employer, attendance becomes more than productivity. It becomes a lifeline because absence can threaten a worker's classification. Even paperwork grows teeth. A misplaced card is not an inconvenience. It is a measurable loss of fuel. Notice how information flows here. The city is trying to send calories to the places it believes will preserve the war effort. It signals priority with larger allocations for certain roles and smaller ones for others. In a normal economy, price signals do that. Here, the signal is a stamp, and stamps can be argued with, forged, or appealed. When the difference between categories is the difference between standing and fainting in the snow, small details suddenly matter. Job titles matter. Shift assignments matter. Your name appearing on a factory list matters. There is also the question of timing. Rations arrive daily or in small intervals, which turns each sunrise into a new calculation. Do you queue early to guarantee supply, using precious energy you could have spent working or staying warm? Do you trade part of today's bread for something more calorie-dense, hoping tomorrow the line is shorter? No one has perfect information, so rumor becomes a kind of shadow notice board. People swap tips about which bakery still has stock, which canteen ladles a fuller scoop, which foreman is strict, and which clerk looks the other way. And the architecture has friction built in. The card might say bread, but your body needs fat and protein. The city tries to supplement with soup kitchens and factory canteens tied to classification, yet the menu is limited by what can be hauled in and processed. That means the official plan describes a neat pyramid, but the lived reality feels like a maze. You move through it using whatever you have, a job assignment, a neighbor's advice, a stronger pair of boots, a little luck. Does this system save lives? It certainly aims to, and in a siege you must aim. It directs scarce calories toward tasks that keep the city functioning. But it also asks citizens to align their choices with the categories, because the categories control the calories. And when choices and categories pull against each other, something gives. People stretch the definitions. Supervisors stretch their discretion. Families stretch each crumb. Every stretch is a tiny negotiation with the architecture of rationing. If there is one lesson from this slide, it is this. Once food is centralized, a job is no longer just a job. It is a ticket class on a lifeboat. The policy may be blunt, but the responses are subtle, a million tiny adjustments, all downstream of a single administrative decision to rank appetites by role. November 20th, 1941. This is the day the numbers bottomed out. Manual workers received 250 grams of bread per day. Everyone else received 125 grams. Not loaves. Grams. We are talking about a piece of bread you could finish in a few bites, and that was supposed to be your fuel for 24 winter hours. What does 125 grams mean to a human body working through cold and stress? It means the math turns cruel. An adult typically needs far more energy just to keep warm, let alone to walk, to stand in line, or to work a shift. With rations at this level, every decision acquires a calorie price tag. Do you stand in the queue an extra hour for a better chance at your allocation, or do you save that energy for the walk home? Do you eat now to stop the dizziness, or do you slice the bread into thin pieces and try to spread it across the day? People began to schedule their days around a wafer of bread. The process itself was ritual and risk combined. Ration cards checked. Stamps inspected. Scales balanced. The clerk shaved crumbs to hit the exact gram. And then the walk back, protecting the ration from the cold, from a stumble, from theft, from your own hunger. Families learn to triage like field medics. A manual worker's 250 grams might be guarded for the one person whose shift kept the household's classification intact. A grandparent might insist on taking less so a child could have more. These are not abstract choices. They are negotiations with survival conducted at a kitchen table. Notice how the categories sharpen under pressure. If the difference between 250 and 125 grams is the difference between standing and fainting, then attendance at work becomes a survival strategy. Paperwork becomes a survival strategy. People sought placements that preserved their status. They tried not to miss roll call. They traded time and favors for a chance at a better line or a slightly fuller ladle at a canteen. The official system said fairness was grams per person according to role. The lived reality said fairness was whatever kept someone upright one more day. And yet, even at this bottom point, time still moved. From December 25th, rations nudged upward. Not abundance. A nudge. Enough to signal that the city might breathe a little, if only through clenched teeth. By February 11th, 1942, allocations rose further above the minimum, offering a slightly wider margin between waking and collapsing. but the memory of November's flaw lingered. People had learned the new arithmetic, and they did not forget it overnight. So hold this image. A city where the day's plan is built around a few measured grams. Where lines at dawn are as much a battle formation as any trench. Where the smallest increase on a ration notice can feel like a sunrise. The hunger minimum is not just a statistic in a book. It is a point on a calendar after which people began to measure life in crumbs, minutes, and steps. By this point in the siege, the word bread had stopped meaning what you and I picture. The loaf was no longer a neat equation of wheat plus water plus yeast. It was a vehicle for whatever the city could mill, mash, or hydrate into something sliceable. Traditional rye still appeared, but in shrinking proportions. To stretch the flour, mills blended in oilseed meals, bran, and various plant pulps. When even those inputs tightened, technicians experimented with hydrated cellulose to add bulk and structure. In other words, the loaf became an engineering project. Now, why does that matter beyond taste? Because not all grams are equal. 125 grams of dense rye bread at peacetime energy values is one thing. 125 grams of a siege-era loaf, with more fiber, more moisture, and less fat, is a very different fuel. Fiber and cellulose add weight but not much usable energy. Extra water raises the scale reading but not the calories. Even the protein from oilseed meals could be hard to digest when your system is cold, exhausted, and underfed. The number on the ration stamp promised weight. Your stomach needed energy. Citizens learned these differences by experience, not chemistry tables. They could feel it in the body. Bread that once carried you through a morning now barely bridged 2 hours. People adapted their habits to squeeze value from every crumb. Some turned rations into soups or porridges, not because soup creates calories, but because hot liquid can slow consumption, warm the body, and make a small portion feel like a meal. Others dried thin slices into rusks near a stove to reduce moisture and delay mold, so the same ration could be eaten slowly without decaying. There were family rituals around slicing, too. You cut with a steady hand, you weighed by eye, you stacked the slices for the day like a plan on a plate. Quality varied from bakery to bakery and day to day because inputs varied. If a batch had more bran or plant pulp, the crumb could be gummy, heavy, even bitter. If it had a bit more rye, morale seemed to lift. That variability itself became a kind of signal. People compared which bakery's bread felt stronger, meaning denser with usable energy, and they were willing to walk farther, or queue earlier, for a loaf that carried them a little longer. Information about bread quality traveled through whispers in lines and the quiet math of how far your legs could take you before the dizziness returned. Households also became small laboratories of substitution. Stretchers is a useful word here. Potato peelings dried and ground into a coarse meal. Carrot or beet pulp saved from preparation. Anything that could add bulk to a soup or thicken a porridge without wasting precious grams of ration bread went into the pot. Tea served more than one purpose. A hot cup took the edge off hunger and, crucially, warmed fingers and faces long enough to preserve energy for the next task. Sugar was rare, so people learned to enjoy heat itself as a flavor. There is another layer to what bread meant. It became a unit of account in daily decisions. You would hear calculations like, if I trade this small keepsake, can I get an extra portion to help my partner make it through a factory shift? Or, if we trade a piece of bread today for a spoonful of fat or a handful of groats, will tomorrow's work go better because the calories are more concentrated? These are micro trades, often within families or between neighbors, but they reveal a simple truth. When official prices freeze and rations fix the weights, people build their own exchange rates at the kitchen table. And still, the loaf itself carried symbolism. Bread had always been a staple, a comfort, a daily anchor. Under siege, it became a test of trust. You trusted the scale at the bakery. You trusted the clerk's hand. You trusted the crumb to hold together on the walk home. The rules around ration cards turned that trust into procedure. Stamps, weighing, tearing. But the first bite after that long walk was not procedural at all. It was relief mixed with worry. Relief that you had it. Worry that it would not be enough. Technicians did what they could, milling at extreme extraction rates to capture any usable flour, experimenting with blends that would hold shape, bake evenly, and not crumble into paste. But engineering cannot invent calories out of thin air. The loaf's job was to carry you to the next ration day and, if possible, carry a worker through a shift. That is why the adaptation strategies mattered: drying, slicing, thinning into broth, trading part of the bread for a spoonful of fat when the chance appeared. These practices did not change the ration. They changed how a body met it. So when we say bread in Leningrad, hear a different word. Hear an instrument. a carefully measured instrument designed to move energy from a shrinking pool of inputs into millions of bodies, one slice at a time. Some days it worked well enough to keep people on their feet. Other days it did not. But every day, the city tried to make that instrument play, and every day, citizens improvised to make its thin notes last. How do you feed a city when every road to it has been cut? You turn a lake into a highway. In winter, Lake Ladoga became the road of life, a broad sheet of ice measured and monitored until it could bear the weight of trucks. In summer, the lake shifted roles and accepted barges and ferries. Same artery, different mode. The point was simple but unforgiving: everything the city could eat, burn, or manufacture had to cross that water. Turning ice into infrastructure is not poetry. It is procedure. Teams went out with drills and poles to test the thickness, marking safe corridors with evergreen branches and flags. Speed limits were strict, not to be fussy, but to prevent pressure waves that can fracture ice beneath a heavy truck. Vehicles were spaced with precision so the lake could spread the load. Headlamps were hooded against bombers. Convoys moved at night or in low light when possible. If a truck broke down, it was hauled aside quickly, because a stalled vehicle on ice is not just an inconvenience. It is a new stress point in a surface you are asking to behave like a road. On shore, everything depended on rhythm. Warehouses on the far side gathered grain, flour, and fuel into standardized sacks and drums so loading crews could work fast with cold hands. Staging yards organized trucks into columns by destination and cargo, while dispatchers watched the weather as if it were an order from headquarters. When a window opened, drivers rolled out in measured lines, listening to the ice groan, keeping to the speed that experience said would keep them safe. The crossing took discipline more than bravado. Drivers learned to read the surface the way sailors read swells. Unloading at the city end was a mirror image. The priority was to get tonnage off the ice and into rail cars or sledges as fast as possible, then out to bakeries, canteens, and factories that could turn sacks into calories and output. Every extra minute on the ice increased risk, so crews practiced a choreography of hooks, slings, and hand carts to keep the flow moving. This is logistics as performance, repeatable, timed, and mostly invisible, unless it fails. And the numbers matter because they measure breathing room. Through the hardest winter stretch, shipments rose steadily. In January 1942, roughly 42,000 tons of food reached the city. By April, that figure nearly doubled to around 87,000 tons. If we count all supplies, not just food, the increase ran from about 52,000 to roughly 113,000 tons per month over that same arc. Those are not abstract totals. They are columns of trucks and lines of barges, each carrying a few more days of city life. Was it enough to make the crisis vanish? No. But scaling the flow meant bakeries could plan a little farther ahead, canteens could ladle slightly fuller scoops, and factories could count on inputs with fewer frightening gaps. The lake corridor was not a miracle. It was a margin, and margins matter when you are living close to the edge. As the seasons turned and the city learned, engineers added more than wheels and hulls. A fuel pipeline was pushed across the lake to reduce the burden on trucks hauling drums, and power cables were laid to stabilize electricity, because without steady current, mills and bakeries slowed to a crawl. These additions did not replace the road and the barges. They reinforced them, turning a precarious lifeline into a slightly broader one. The road of life is often remembered as a symbol. It deserves that. But it should also be remembered as a system. Testing, marking, dispatching, loading, crossing, unloading. Every step added or subtracted risk. When the steps were followed and the weather cooperated, the city breathed. When they were not, the ice reminded everyone that nature sets the terms. In siege conditions, logistics is not background. It is the plot. Here is the uncomfortable arithmetic. How much food does a city actually need each day just to avoid collapse? Wartime planners did not guess. They multiplied a minimum caloric target per person by the number of ration recipients, then converted those calories into flour, groats, fats, and other staples, and finally into tonnage that trucks and barges would have to carry. Different offices produced different figures, but one thing was consistent. The totals were large, and the margins for error were small. Think in ranges, because ranges are honest under uncertainty. Estimates for bare survival often landed between 500 and 1,000 tons of food per day, depending on how many people you count and what basket of foods you assume. Now put that next to early deliveries across Ladoga in the first phase. For days at a time, inflows were measured in the tens of tons, not hundreds. That gap is not a rounding problem. It is a survival problem. It explains why the city felt like it was balancing on the edge of a blade through the winter of 1941 to 42. Why do these numbers stretch so quickly? Because grams at the bakery have to cover more than a quiet day at room temperature. Cold makes bodies burn energy just to keep warm. Lines cost energy. Walking to a job costs energy. Lifting and hauling at a factory costs even more. So when you pick a minimum ration, you are not describing a comfortable maintenance diet. You are describing a threshold that barely keeps a person on their feet in sub-zero conditions with long waits and hard work. And even tonnage on paper is not the same as calories in mouths. Some flour is lost to spillage, spoilage, or milling inefficiency. A truck stuck on the ice is not feeding anyone. Not every convoy makes it on time. Bakeries can only turn sacks into loaves at the speed of their ovens and the steadiness of the power supply. Each friction point shaves a little off the theoretical total, which means your plan needs to overshoot just to hit the real target. There is also the composition problem. 500 tons of food made up mostly of flour does not carry the same usable energy as 500 tons that include fat and protein. Flour is essential for bread, but fat is a compact way to raise calories and keep people warm. So the definition of enough is not just how many tons, but which tons. If barges deliver the wrong mix, you can meet your weight target and still miss the body's needs. From the logistics side, enough collides with physics. How many trucks can the ice safely carry per hour? What is the average payload per vehicle after accounting for fuel, crew, and spare parts? How long is the round trip, including loading, unloading, and forced pauses for weather or raids? If you can move, for example, 200 trucks in a night at a few tons each, and you lose a third of your nights to conditions, your monthly totals will climb, but your daily averages will still dip and spike. Human bodies, unfortunately, cannot eat monthly. They need daily. So planners did what planners do under constraint. They smoothed scarcity with queues and schedules, they shielded key workers with higher rations, and they tried to expand the corridor's capacity piece by piece. As the road of life scaled from those first fragile crossings to stronger flows by spring, the graph bent in the right direction. Monthly totals rose into the tens of thousands of tons. That did not make the crisis disappear, but it changed the shape of it. Bakeries could plan beyond tomorrow. Canteens could promise a ladle with fewer terrifying gaps. Households could gamble a little less with whether to eat now or save until evening. But the core lesson of this slide is simple and sobering. In siege conditions, enough is not a slogan. It is a moving target defined by bodies, weather, composition of cargo, and the mechanics of transport. If any one of those shifts in the wrong direction, the city slides back toward the edge. If 2 or 3 shift at once, the edge arrives faster than policy can catch it. That is why each additional convoy mattered so much. Not because it solved everything, but because it nudged the daily average closer to a line where people could stand up, walk to work, and come home again. Look closely at what the winter did to the city. As temperatures fell and rations hit their lows, registered deaths surged, peaking in January and February of 1942 at roughly 100,000 per month. The causes on paper often read as dystrophy, which is a bureaucratic way of saying the body ran out of fuel. But behind that single word were many pathways to the same end. Cold rooms where stoves had no fuel. Long walks to queues that cost more energy than the ration could replace. Infections that a well-fed body might have fought off, but a starving one could not. Each line on a registry was a story of energy lost faster than it could be put back. Exposure turned minor problems into fatal ones. Think about hands that never fully warmed, feet that stayed damp inside worn boots, the small frost bits that slowed people down and made every errand cost more calories. Public transport sputtered, trams and trolley lines stopped and started with the power supply. So people walked more. Walking in deep snow is a quiet thief of energy. You reach the bakery already spent, and the bread you collect has to refill what the walk just drained. Record-keeping itself buckled under strain. Not every death was registered promptly. Some were carried to collection points days later because families had to decide what to do first: find wood, find bread, find help. Burial crews were short of fuel and equipment. Cemeteries grew quickly. Statistics are useful, but when systems are overloaded, statistics arrive late and thin. Diaries, letters, and small notes on the back of ration cards fill in the texture. They tell us how neighborhoods tried to keep each other moving, and how that sometimes worked, and sometimes did not. Agency did not vanish. It changed form. A neighbor with a sledge might help move someone who could no longer walk. People shared tips about which canteen served a slightly thicker soup or which bakery's loaves felt heavier with usable calories. Households organized their days like field plans. One person queued. Another scavenged fuel. Someone else guarded the room, because a stove that finally caught was precious. Even small decisions mattered, like whether to eat the ration in one sitting to quiet the dizziness, or to slice it into portions for morning, afternoon, and evening to smooth the day's energy curve. Workplaces became lifelines not just for wages, but for calories and heat. Factory canteens, when supplied, provided a bowl of something warm tied to attendance. That meant showing up could be the difference between fainting and staying on your feet. Foremen and clerks became gatekeepers of more than schedules. Their discretion could mean an extra ladle or a quiet look the other way when someone needed to sit down. This is not sentimentality. It is how human networks operate when the formal system is stretched to the breaking point. Rules continue, but they are interpreted through people. Listen to the voices in the diaries. They record generosity and strain side by side. A family shares a slice with a neighbor today knowing they may ask for help tomorrow. A mother trades a keepsake for a spoonful of fat to help a son finish a shift. Someone chooses to brave the wind for a rumor of flour, and someone else decides to conserve energy and wait for afternoon. None of these choices change the weather or the blockade. They change the slope of a single day for a single household. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of small, stubborn decisions, and you understand why the city did not simply stop. So the curve of mortality tells a hard truth about systems under extreme scarcity. When the inputs collapse and the temperature drops, averages move quickly, and they move in the wrong direction. Yet within that harsh curve, people still find levers they can reach. A sledge, a stove, a canteen bowl, a neighbor's advice about a better line. Agency at the edge is not dramatic. It is incremental. It is the difference between falling today and standing until tomorrow. Start with the intention, because intentions matter. City authorities looked at a shrinking pool of food and fuel and asked the most practical question possible: how do we keep the war effort and the urban organism alive at the same time? The answer on paper was to concentrate scarce calories where they would yield the most output. Defense factories, transport crews, power workers, medical staff. Those roles received higher rations and steadier canteen access. The rest of the population received less, scaled to perceived necessity. Add inspection teams, card registers, and delivery quotas, and you have a design that tries to turn fairness into a set of measurable steps. In an emergency, centralization can do things quickly that markets cannot. It can prioritize a bakery's flour over a private kitchen. It can decide that tram electricians eat more than typists this week. It can send a truck to a hospital first and explain later. The structure is meant to shield critical functions from chaos. You see that in the paperwork: job categories linked to ration tiers, attendance lists tied to canteen bowls, closed distributions for certain essential units that must not fail. The logic is clear. Keep the arteries open, even if the fingers go numb. But policies do not operate in a vacuum. They operate through people, and people respond to the incentives those policies create. Once calories are linked to categories, a job title becomes a food allocation device. Attendance becomes more than duty, it is access. Supervisors gain quiet power because their signatures validate classifications and unlock bowls. Clerks matter because their stamps decide whether a card is honored today. None of this is villainy by design. It is gravity. Where decisions gather, influence gathers. Now follow the chain. Priority rations raise the value of being on the right list. That raises the value of documents and the people who handle them. Suddenly, the friction around paperwork becomes a survival cost. A misfiled card is not a clerical error, it is lost calories. A delay in updating a roster is not an inconvenience, it is a skipped meal. Most officials do their best inside a system under strain, but strain turns small errors into large consequences. And when the gap between categories is the difference between standing and fainting, appeals, favors, and quiet exceptions multiply. Leakage appears wherever a system forces one path for many needs. A truck that unloads late is an opportunity for theft. A warehouse that counts by sacks rather than usable flour will report the correct number and still miss the losses to moisture, pests, and haste. A canteen that stretches soup to serve everyone on the list will meet the plan and still send people away hungry. These are not scandals in the modern sense, they are the predictable losses of a process that tries to control more than it can measure. Then there is the blunt force problem. If you criminalize private trade because you fear hoarding and speculation, you remove one way for information to surface. Prices cannot adjust, so cues do the signaling instead. Time in line becomes a hidden tax. Stronger bodies pay it more easily than weaker ones, which tilts the field. Enforcement steps in to restore order, checks, raids, penalties. That suppresses some abuses but also drives adaptation. People learn to move around checkpoints, to time their errands, to rely on relationships more than rules. The map of the city begins to show two layers, the official routes and the practiced routes. A different kind of inequality also creeps in, not the inequality of wealth but the inequality of proximity. If your home sits near a well-supplied bakery, your ration card converts to bread with less loss of energy and time. If your workplace has a canteen that actually serves, attendance feeds you and the walk home is shorter. If you are far from both, the same grams on the card buy less survival because the cost of collecting them is higher. The policy is uniform on paper, the city is anything but uniform on the ground. Consider the feedback loop this creates. Shortfalls lead to stricter controls. Stricter controls increase the value of access. Increased value of access increases the temptation to bend rules. Bent rules lead to uneven outcomes that look like favoritism, even when they are simply the sum of 1,000 small discretionary moments. Authorities respond with more audits and penalties, which consume time and energy that could have moved food. The system remains necessary, because without it, chaos wins, but it also becomes heavier, because every new safeguard adds weight. The intention was to preserve capacity where it mattered most, and at many moments it did just that. The unintended consequences were not a different policy with bad aims. They were the shadow of the same policy meeting reality, paperwork turning into power, queues turning into taxes, small losses aggregating into thin rations, discretion multiplying where rules meet cold and hunger. The lesson is not cynical. It is practical. Centralized triage can keep a city from falling apart, but it cannot see every edge case it creates. People will fill those gaps with the tools at hand, documents, relationships, timing, and the quiet negotiations of daily life. When official prices freeze and rations speak in fixed grams, information does not disappear. It goes underground. In Leningrad, the moment food became a stamped entitlement rather than a traded good, people began to build side channels to solve problems the paperwork could not see. Call it the shadow economy if you like, but think of it first as a set of signals: who has a little extra, who needs it desperately, and what someone is willing to give up today for enough energy to stand tomorrow. Barter led the way. A watch for a bag of flour. A pair of good boots for a small tin of fat. Family keepsakes converted into calories with a lump in the throat and no time for sentiment. Why fat? Because a single spoonful could lift a day's ration from symbol to fuel. Bread was heavy but not always energetic. Fat was small but potent. So households began to quote prices in their own units: 3 slices of bread for 1 spoon of oil, a day's bread for a cup of groats, 2 days for a handful of sugar. None of this was printed in a ledger. It lived in whispers and glances and the quiet math of kitchens. Location created opportunity. Intersections near bakeries, tram stops that still worked, corridors by warehouses and rail sidings, stairwells in crowded apartment blocks. Wherever rations were converted into food in motion, someone tried to smooth the shortage for a price. The city had declared private trade of staple foods illegal to suppress hoarding and speculation. But scarcity has a way of making rules into puzzles. A person who knew a clerk, or a driver, or a canteen worker might learn when a little extra would appear, and what it would cost. Not in rubles printed on paper. In risk. In favors. In bread. Risk is the tax of underground exchange. Sellers demanded a premium because they were breaking rules, and buyers paid it because the alternative was a fainting spell at a factory lathe or a child who could not stop shivering. That risk premium turned alleys into markets that could vanish when patrols appeared. It also created price dispersion. The same spoon of fat did not cost the same everywhere. If you were far from a supply point or news arrived late, you paid more. If you had good information or better timing, you paid less. In a normal city, price boards announce this. In a besieged city, the board is rumor, and the currency is trust. Not all shadow exchange looked like a marketplace. Much of it moved through relationships. Neighbors who pooled rations and cooked together to save fuel. Workers who shared a canteen ladle when one of them had a bad day. A foreman who quietly slipped a weak colleague into a warmer task so the person could stay on the list and keep the higher ration tier. These are trades, too, just not counted in grams. You give your time to queue for someone who cannot stand long. Tomorrow, they share a bit of fat because your shift ran over and the bakery line closed. Reciprocity stitched together households at a time when formal systems could not catch every fall. Of course, there were harsher edges. Ration cards were stolen or forged. A few middlemen skimmed from sacks and sold in tiny parcels at frightening prices. Enforcement units raided meeting points, seized goods, and posted warnings to deter others. Each raid moved the trade to a new corner. Each warning raised the risk premium. The authorities' fear of hoarding was not imaginary. In a city living day to day, a small stockpile could look like a threat to the plan. But a household would see the same stockpile as a buffer that might get them through a bad week. Two rationalities met in the dark and collided. Economically, this slide carries a simple but powerful idea. When a central plan fixes quantities and punishes private exchange, information about relative scarcity does not flow through prices on a storefront. It flows through time spent in queues, through who knows whom, through quiet negotiations that substitute relationships for markets. The system wanted to direct calories to vital roles. The shadow system wanted to direct calories to urgent needs, as defined by the person whose hands were shaking. Sometimes those aims aligned. Often they did not. And in the space between them, a city survived in part by breaking the rules meant to save it. If you listen carefully, you can hear the language citizens invented for this world. Not numbers on a price tag, but measures that live in the body. How many steps can I take on this portion? How many hours of warmth does this spoon of fat buy? How much strength does a cup of soup add to a night shift? Those are prices, too, just not printed. They are felt. And in a winter where every decision had a calorie cost, the shadow market was a map of feeling made practical. When a city cannot feed everyone, movement becomes medicine. Evacuation across Lake Ladoga was not a side story. It was a second strategy running in parallel with bread. The winter ice road and the summer barges did double duty. Inbound, they carried flour, fuel, and parts. Outbound, when the weather and the schedule allowed, they carried people. Children first. The sick and elderly next. Then anyone whom the lists and the windows of opportunity could accommodate. By 1942, roughly 1 million people had been moved out in waves. Think of that not just as a number, but as pressure release, so the ration line inside the city grew a little shorter the next morning. How do you move that many human beings under siege? You do it with lists. Assembly points. And timing that feels like triage. Families received notices telling them where to gather and when. Baggage limits were strict. A heavy suitcase is not just heavy. It is a slower loading time, a weaker plank under stress, a delay that pushes the convoy closer to daylight and bombers. So the rule became brutal and simple. Bring what you can carry quickly. Bring what will keep you warm. Leave the rest. Many people tried to smuggle one small extra bundle anyway. The inspectors sometimes looked away. Sometimes they did not. On the ice, bodies are payload. Too many, and the stress on the surface changes. Too few, and you waste a crossing. Dispatchers tried to fill the returning trucks with evacuees while keeping to the spacing and speed limits that kept the lake intact beneath them. Silence was part of the procedure. Engines low, headlights hooded. The sound of tires on ice. No speeches, just motion. A stalled truck meant a choke point. A choke point meant risk. So loading crews developed a rhythm: up the step, sit where you are told, hold the rail, no one moves until the driver waves you down on the other side. Summer changed the mode but not the logic. Barges replaced trucks. The corridor was still narrow. Weather still owned the schedule. Enemy aircraft still hunted for shapes on water. People huddled under tarps or in holds, counting the minutes until disembarkation, then counting again until a rail car or a bus took them farther from the front. For many, the journey did not feel like rescue. It felt like exchange. You traded proximity to home for proximity to food. You traded familiar streets for the possibility of a ration that arrived on time. Inside the city, evacuation created choices as hard as any queue. Do you send a child out alone with a note pinned to a coat, hoping for a receiving center and a kind administrator on the other shore? Do you keep an elderly parent with you because they will not survive the cold of the crossing, even though staying reduces everyone's ration share? If a worker's presence keeps the household in a higher ration tier, do they remain while others go? None of these decisions were made with full information. They were made at kitchen tables with a pencil stub, a ration card, and a rumor about tomorrow's convoy. Administration tried to impose order on heartbreak. Priority categories were posted. Medical staff assessed who could travel and who needed a day or two to stabilize. Trains and buses on the far side were coordinated to prevent bottlenecks at the landing sites. Volunteers and officials carried children to loading points when legs gave out. A city under siege still had clerks who stamped names and nurses who whispered reassurance and drivers who quietly shifted their coats so a small passenger could feel heat for a few minutes. Those gestures did not change the tonnage logs. They changed a single person's odds. Every seat for a person was, in a way, a crate that could not be carried. That is the trade-off that haunted planners. If you fill the return leg with evacuees, you relieve pressure on tomorrow's rations. If you fill it with more sacks of flour, you feed those who remain. There is no perfect allocation. There is only the attempt to find the least damaging balance. Early in the winter, freight often won because the system itself might have failed without it. As flows stabilized and the ice held, evacuation scaled. You can see the logic. First, keep the city breathing. Then, make the city smaller so each breath is easier. Evacuation also rearranged the social map. Apartments emptied. Schools thinned. Factories recalculated shift rosters. A block that once depended on a grandmother's watchful eye now relied on a neighbor. Letters from the interior, when they arrived, became more than news. They were proof that the corridor worked both ways. That people did not simply vanish into the fog of war. The knowledge that there was an after somewhere beyond the lake steadied some who stayed. It also pulled at them. Every day you did not take a place on a truck was a day you asked fate for one more chance. If there is a lesson in the human logistics of evacuation, it is that movement is a resource, just like flour or fuel. It has a carrying capacity. It has bottlenecks. It can be hoarded by those with better information or better proximity. And when managed well enough to run on most days, it changes everything inside the city by one small degree. Fewer mouths for the same loaves. Fewer bodies in the same lines. Fewer children shivering in rooms without wood. In siege economics, relief is measured in increments. Evacuation was one of those increments, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, until the city's breathing space widened just enough to matter. If calories are currency, factories are the mint. In Leningrad, war production did not stop, it limped, improvised, and kept moving just enough to matter. Picture a machine shop where the soundscape has changed. Fewer hammers. Longer pauses. Workers thinner than their protective aprons. A lathe that should hum at a steady pitch now stutters because the power flickers, and every flicker means lost precision, lost minutes, lost warmth. Rations were not just food. They were an attendance policy. Show up, and a canteen bowl might be waiting. Miss a day, and your household risks sliding into a lower ration tier. That creates a feedback loop. The factory needs your body to keep the line alive. Your body needs the factory to keep your ration alive. So people did arithmetic that no one teaches in school. Can I stand the tram ride today? If the tram is not running, can I walk there and still have enough left to hold a tool steady? If I make it in, will the canteen actually serve, or will I spend the last of my energy for a stamp and an apology? Inside the workshops, managers became choreographers. They shifted tasks to match who could stand and who could sit. They paired weaker workers with steadier ones for heavy lifts. They shortened some steps and lengthened others so the flow would not collapse when the power dipped. It was not elegant. It was practical. A shop that once measured output by quotas now measured it by what could be finished before the next blackout or the next raid siren. Materials did not arrive on a smooth schedule. Steel, fuel, lubricants, bearings, belts. Every missing part is a cascade. If you have shells but no fuses, you have no shells. If you have a motor but no oil, you have a sculpture. So foreman learned the art of cannibalization. One idle machine gives up a belt to keep another alive. A toolroom trades its last bottle of lubricant to the stamping press because, today, the press feeds the most urgent order. That kind of decision is not written in any manual. It is taught by the stare of a deadline and the feel of a wrench in cold hands. The power grid was the invisible boss. When current stabilized, even for a few hours, output jumped as if someone had opened a valve. Mills ran. Ovens baked. Welders worked without fear of ruining a seam mid-bead. When current sagged, productivity collapsed in a way that had nothing to do with courage or will. You cannot cut steel by wishing. You need amperage. The city tried to shore up the grid piece by piece. When additional lines and cables came online, it did not feel like victory. It felt like a long exhale you could finally take without choking. Skill became a ration category of its own, whether or not the paperwork said so. A machinist who could hold a tolerance with numb fingers was worth more than a dozen untrained hands. Supervisors protected those people. Extra ladles appeared. A warmer task found its way to their station. Apprentices learned at triple speed, not because anyone had time to teach, but because the line would stop if they did not. You saw teenagers at benches, older workers at gauges, women mastering heavy tools that had once been gatekept by tradition. The siege erased many customs in an afternoon. What stayed were the tasks and the bodies willing to do them. Absenteeism was a measure of hunger, not laziness. When a worker did not appear, there were reasons written in bone. A fainting spell on the stairs. A child too weak to leave alone. A pair of boots that finally fell apart and could not be repaired with string and hope. Managers knew this, many had the same problems at home. Punishments existed on paper. In practice, discretion ruled. A quiet pass here. A borrowed coat there. A seat by the radiator for 5 minutes so a worker could warm their hands enough to trust them with a blade. Output figures from this period can look unimpressive next to peacetime charts. That misses the point. Each finished part represented a chain that held against weather, hunger, and chance. A barge delivered ore. A truck crossed the lake. A warehouse clerk signed. A power line held. A foreman gambled a scarce bottle of oil on a machine that might seize anyway. A worker chose to walk in rather than save energy at home. Add enough links like that, and you get a shipment that leaves the city instead of a story about why it could not. Economists sometimes talk about the margin, the place where a small change flips an outcome. In Leningrad's factories, the margin was a bowl of soup, a functioning tram, a spare belt in a drawer, an hour of stable power after midnight. The ration system tried to push calories toward that margin by rewarding attendance and prioritizing essential roles. The unintended counterpart was the constant negotiation around those rewards, because when survival is pegged to a stamp, the stamp becomes a tool in its own right. So picture a day's end whistle that is more sigh than blast. Workers file out slower than they arrived. Some lean on each other for the first steps until the blood returns to their legs. A few carry home small scraps for repair jobs that keep a neighborhood's hinges swinging and stoves from rattling apart. Production under siege did not look heroic in the moment. It looked stubborn. And stubborn was enough to keep the lights flickering and the lines, somehow, alive. Open a diary from the siege, and the war shrinks from maps to a kitchen table. The entries are not about divisions and fronts. They are about a mother deciding whether to split a crust 3 ways or save it for the one who still has to walk to work at dawn. They are about a neighbor's knock at night when the stove has finally caught, and the tiny debate between conserving heat and opening the door. These pages record choices that statistics cannot feel. Share or save. Tell the truth or repeat the bulletin because hope, even false hope, might keep someone moving. People wrote about the sounds their bodies made when hungry, the tremor in their hands, the way a single spoon of fat could change an afternoon. They measured time in lines and footsteps. They measured luck in warm seats on a tram that ran that day. The words are plain, often short, and that is what makes them powerful. They do not argue. They witness. Dignity appears in small acts. A son takes the heavier bucket. A stranger steadies an old man in the queue without speaking. A nurse divides a ladle just a little differently because she can see who is shaking. A clerk stamps a card even though the signature looks imperfect, deciding that today the rule bends toward mercy. None of these moments change the blockade or the weather. They change one person's slope, turning a steep descent into something closer to level for a few hours. The diaries also show how truth competes with survival. A bulletin on a wall promises more flour soon. Is it true? Maybe. Does it help people endure one more night? Sometimes. Writers wrestle with that tension. They want honesty, but they also understand that despair is a kind of theft. So they calibrate their words. They write what they know, and when they do not know, they record what they hope without pretending it is news. In that way, private pages become a moral instrument, tuned to both reality and the fragile need to keep going. Trade is not absent here, it is softened by relationship. A widow trades a keepsake for a spoon of oil, then writes down why she chose that day and not the next. A family shares half their ration with a neighbor because the neighbor has a child who still works a factory shift, and the whole building needs that shift to happen. These are economic decisions, but the currency is not only bread. It is trust, reputation, the memory of who helped last week. The diaries map a network more flexible than any ration schedule, a network that moves calories along lines of care when formal routes are thin. There is guilt on these pages, too. Writers confess cutting their share a little and then eating it early. They confess resenting someone stronger in the queue. They confess the heavy relief of getting a slightly heavier loaf while others did not. Rather than indicting themselves, they record the ordinary truth that morality and biology were wrestling inside the same cold room. The entries often end with small vows: tomorrow I will share, tomorrow I will be braver, tomorrow I will get up earlier. The vows are not always kept, and the next page says so. That honesty is its own kind of courage. Workplaces show up again and again as moral crossroads. If attendance brings a bowl of soup, do you tell a weak coworker to stay home or help them to the gate because the stamp will feed their family? Foremen write about bending the rules, shifting someone to a warmer task, or looking away when a worker needs to sit down. None of this makes it into official reports. It lives in sentences like, "Today I let him rest," or "Today she gave me her portion." That is the city functioning at the margins, held together by decisions that cannot be standardized. When you finish a diary entry, you are left with a clear impression. Under extreme scarcity, ethics becomes granular. It is not a speech about right and wrong. It is a question whispered at a doorway: do we have enough to share this hour? It is an action taken with a quick glance to see who is watching, not out of shame, but out of caution in a world where rules and kindness meet at uneven angles. The pages do not tell us that people were saints or villains. They tell us that people were people, trying to keep warm without getting anyone else cold, trying to eat without taking too much, trying to speak honestly without stealing hope. If the earlier slides showed systems and shipments, these entries show the human gears those systems turned. They remind us that survival is not only measured in tons and grams. It is also measured in the tone of a nurse's voice, the steadiness of a stranger's arm, and the choice to open a door when the stove is finally warm. That is not sentimentality. It is logistics at the scale of a single room, written down before sleep, so the writer can believe that tomorrow is possible. When you step back from Leningrad and look sideways at other sieges, certain patterns flicker into focus. Different flags, different decades, different ideologies, yet the same economic physics keeps showing up. Take the Warsaw Ghetto during the early 1940s. Official rations were set far below subsistence. On paper, there was a system. In practice, survival passed through gaps in walls, through cellars, through small hands that could slip under boards and bring back a heel of bread. Prices could not adjust in the open, so risk became the surcharge. A loaf cost one number if you knew a guard, another number if you knew a tunnel, and a third if you only knew how to stand in a line. Enforcers tried to seal the holes, smugglers learned new routes. The moral math was merciless and intimate: a family heirloom for a few meals, a neighbor's warning about a patrol, a shared bowl that bought someone one more day. Jump ahead to Sarajevo in the 1990s. The city was ringed by hills and watched by scopes. Trucks could not simply roll in, so aid came by air, by convoys, and through a tunnel cut under an airport. Again, the pattern: official distributions tried to equalize scarcity, informal markets tried to reassign calories to where the pulse felt weakest at that moment. Cigarettes turned into a makeshift currency because they were divisible, portable, and widely recognized. Water, wood, and cooking fuel became as precious as food because calories don't help if you cannot boil a pot or stay warm long enough to digest. Q signaled shortage. Risk-taking signaled opportunity. The price of a liter or a loaf swung with the weather, the shelling, and the rumor of deliveries. Across these cases, you can plot the same cause and effect chain. When open prices are suppressed and movement is dangerous, information about what is scarce finds other routes. It travels in footsteps and whispers. It pools around people with access: drivers, guards, clerks, mechanics, anyone who can tilt a valve a few degrees. The system on paper aims for order. The system on the ground bends toward workarounds. Neither is villainy by itself. It is the shape scarcity takes when it meets human ingenuity and fear. Another repeating feature is the inequality of proximity. Two families may hold identical ration cards, but the one living near a functioning distribution point, or along a safer corridor, effectively owns a better card. Distance becomes a tax. Danger becomes a tax. Time in line becomes a tax. Those hidden taxes sort people by strength, by luck, and by who can afford to spend an extra hour outdoors without collapsing. You can call it unfair. It is also predictable whenever cues substitute for prices. And then there is the moral economy, the layer that never fits neatly on a chart. In each siege, networks of reciprocity kept reappearing. A neighbor who owns a cart. A nurse with discretion at the ladle. A shop foreman who rotates the weakest worker to a warmer task. These are not markets in the classical sense, but they allocate scarce things all the same, favoring the known face, the recent kindness, the reputation for sharing. That can look like favoritism from above. From inside a stairwell on a freezing night, it looks like survival. The differences matter, too. In Warsaw, the occupiers' policy aimed at annihilation. Underground exchange became a form of defiance as much as subsistence. In Leningrad, a defending city used rationing to preserve a war effort while an enemy tried to starve it out from the perimeter. In Sarajevo, international airlifts and a clandestine tunnel altered the logistics mix, adding outside tonnage and a narrow artery under the runway. Distinct contexts, distinct rules, and yet the same basic lesson: when official channels are narrow and static, unofficial channels widen and move. So if you draw a line through these comparisons, it reads like this. Fix the quantities, and people will start fixing the shortages themselves. Criminalize the fix, and they will price in the risk. Shut one door, and they will look for a window. Some of those windows will be generous. Some will be cruel. All will be responsive to signals that paper cannot fully capture. That is not an argument for chaos. It is a reminder that in the worst conditions, human beings build parallel systems because survival dislikes bottlenecks. Here is the thread that ties our story together. In Leningrad, survival did not hinge on slogans or speeches. It hinged on throughput. Calories in, work out, and the narrow margins that connected them. Ration cards were the visible rules, but logistics set the real boundaries. When the lake held, the numbers nudged upward and people stood a little steadier. When it cracked or the power flickered, the city shrank back toward the edge. Policies aimed to protect the core, factories, hospitals, transport, power. That intention saved lives. Yet every layer of control created smaller eddies, paperwork that gained weight, queues that became a tax, proximity that turned into quiet privilege. Those were not abstractions. They were costs measured in footsteps, in body heat, in minutes of strength left at the end of a shift. And when official channels were too narrow, people built parallel ones out of trust, rumor, and risk, black markets to you and me, but often just neighbors solving problems the forms could not see. What changed outcomes most were the systems that moved information and energy quickly. A stable convoy schedule, a reliable canteen ladle tied to attendance, a timely repair to a power line, a foreman's discretion deployed at the right moment. None of these erased scarcity. They bent it. They bent it enough to keep machines turning and families negotiating one more day. That is why the phrase calories win is not cynical. It is descriptive. In the cold math of a siege, the side that can turn shipments into usable food, usable heat, and usable work, consistently and with fewer leaks, wins the next sunrise. There is a moral question under the numbers. Who bears the hidden taxes when lines replace prices? Who benefits when access routes run through relationships rather than storefronts? And what mixture of centralized provision and decentralized signals moves scarce goods to the right place fastest when minutes matter? The evidence here does not shout an ideology. It whispers something practical. When power is used to ration, it must also remain humble enough to listen to weak signals from bakeries, to diaries from stairwells, to the quiet map of where energy is actually needed today. So remember Leningrad not only as a ring of armies, but as a city of systems under strain. Ledgers and ladles. Ice and engines. Stamps and small kindnesses. The outcome was written, day after day, in the meeting point between those systems and the millions of decisions people made with cold hands and clear eyes. If this helped you see the siege through both numbers and lives, tap like, drop a comment with the moment that struck you most, and subscribe for more deep dives that make history usable. And if you want to go further, check out my book History They Tried to Erase in the description. If you enjoy thoughtful, entertaining history that respects your intelligence, there is plenty more waiting for you on Truth Behind History.